right. Morgan Appel is the Assistant Dean for Education and Community Outreach at the Division of Extended Studies at UC San Diego, overseeing a diverse array of globally based programming, PK post-retirement, including opportunities for students, practitioners, administrators, parents, and community stakeholders in English and Spanish. He's previously served as Director of Education Programs at UC Irvine's Division of Continuing Education, following a research appointment at the Claire Trevor School of the Arts at UC Irvine. With expertise in binational education, transformation, and policy, Morgan Appel has worked with a number of school districts, universities, and research institutes in the United States and Latin America to explore the impacts of change agentry across segments of education. Professional specialties include gifted and talented education, the neuroscience of teaching and learning, arts integration, parent and caregiver education, and organizational behavior in education institutions. Beyond his current administrative appointment, Appel teaches a variety of courses at both UC Davis and UC Irvine and is the host of Creative Conversations on the Education Channel at UCTV. In addition to all of this, I will say that Morgan has become an incredible friend to the El Dorado County Charter SELPA, and for this we are incredibly grateful. He has been featured on our podcast and was a speaker at our Inspiration to Action Symposium. So Morgan, thank you for sharing your time with us today. We're really excited to learn from you.
No, thank you so very much, Carrie. And I don't know if I can beat that introduction, so I probably should just leave now while I'm still on top. But no, I do very am grateful to you. I'm grateful to all of you who are attending and to anybody who may be watching this recording. And today we're going to talk about a real passion of mine, which is looking at neurodiversity and looking at multi-exceptional learners. Now, multi-exceptionality, and in the past we've referred to dual exceptionality. We've referred to 2E for the most part, but for multi-exceptionality, it really lies on the frontiers of research in education, as it is one of the most significant and misunderstood elements of it. And confusion about what constitutes multiple exceptionalities can result in under-identification, misidentification, or de facto denial of services. So what we see, and we'll explore this in greater depth as we move forward, that in certain cases, the giftedness that presents and the disability that presents mask one another, yielding a zero net effect. So you are not perhaps identified as gifted, or you're not identified as eligible for certain other services. And these are processes that are frustrating for individuals who require the services, for parents and for teachers. So in a very real way, it can be a very precise type of science, but also a real artistry involved. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a teacher named Juniette who was talking about what she calls 3E, multiple exceptional kids. And she says, oscillating between the different words of their identity, 3E children often struggle to understand the world. I remember when my child first started coloring in his class, and he would select peach crayons, combining them to make caramel in a diverse range of colors on people. When I would ask why, testing to see what he knew about race, he would say, everyone looks a different shade of brown. So that sort of abstract thinking, that sort of creative thinking are really part and parcel of what we might see in a multiple exceptional learner, be they a child or be they an adult. And if you are a multi-exceptional learner, if you are a neurodiverse learner, you're in really good company. And just a few here, we talk about Albert Einstein, who is absolutely amazing in so many ways, but was not great with conventional math. We have Leonardo da Vinci, who was a multi-potentiate, who really didn't see the dividing lines between different disciplines in education and really combine them. Simone Biles, Thomas Edison, Temple Grandin, Pablo Picasso, Agatha Christie, Salma Hayek, Yara Shahidi, who used to star in a television program called Blackish and went on to script writing and directing and a number of other things. Octavia Butler, Stevie Wonder, and many, many more. And, absent the support, these talents may not have come to be manifest. So, really, what are we talking about when we're talking about multi exceptional learners? Well, when we look at a formal definition, we talk about three or more distinctive exceptionalities. When we used to talk about dual exceptionalism, or we used to talk about 2E, usually we would talk about being identified gifted or potentially gifted, and also being diagnosed with a specific learning disability under IDEA. But we realized that things were a lot more complex, and we had not really accounted for in an environment in which a child grows up, whether it's socioeconomics or culture or anything like that. So we look at the different intersectionalities. So when we talk about multiple exceptions, we're talking about three or more distinctive exceptionalities, beginning typically with gifted, but also a neurodivergent condition that impacts traditional learning. Oftentimes, we're talking about a second identified learning disability. We're talking about perhaps mental health challenges. We may be talking about attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We may be talking about anxiety. We may be talking about post traumatic stress disorder. But really, it is a very complex tapestry of elements that we're looking at, perhaps cultural and linguistic diversity, socioeconomic challenges. And again, it is a mosaic of factors that complicate identification and support that is conventionally delivered, because oftentimes we will not see the nuances, we will not see the shades of gray. So it is not something that's easygoing. There are no, here are 10 great hacks for the multi-exceptional learner. It takes really the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. So when we're talking about giftedness and giftedness and talent are really two different things, but typically we're looking at individuals with advanced problem-solving abilities. We are looking at individuals who can, let's say, look at a math problem, look at a word problem, and the answer just appears immediately to them, as if they were reaching out of the sky, a la A Beautiful Mind. And oftentimes, when asked, well, how did you get the answer? It proves frustrating, because they will say, well, what does it matter? I got the answer right. Why do you care how I got there? This, of course, works very well for, let's say, elementary math, but when you get to geometry, where you're asked to prove how you got to the conclusion you reached, it can be a bit daunting for them. With giftedness, we see very abstract thinking. We see kids who can sort of pull diverse elements together and reach a conclusion that we as practitioners, will say, we have this and we have this, we have this, and at the very end we wrap it in a bow and say, aha, see how this all came together, and they're saying, well, yeah, I knew that, as soon as you started talking. High verbal ability and sophistication. So these are third graders who will come into class and say, oh, good morning, how's your portfolio performing today? And gloomy weather we're having, isn't it? And, this sort of wonderful conversational ability, very advanced senses of humor, more, I would say, cognitive than anything else. And the great thing for a practitioner and working with gifted kids is they get your jokes. But again, this level of verbal ability, this level of sophistication does not necessarily mean that they are advanced socio-emotionally, because these are the same kids who you may see throwing themselves on the ground because they got an A minus instead of an A. We see elements of creativity and divergent thinking, using sources of data from all over the place to come together in some kind of an amalgam to solve a problem. But truly, when we think of giftedness and talent, the real sort of watchword is intensity. The emotions that they experience are very intense, There's no sort of middle ground. They're intensely happy. They're intensely sad. Um, and very much can attribute this to asynchronous development. And when we talk about giftedness and talent, we talk about asynchronous development, we're really talking about how do humans develop. So if you grow a year physically, you should grow a year cognitively or intellectually, grow a year social emotionally. But for many of our gifted and talented, they may grow a year physically, they may grow 5 years cognitively, and sometimes they will regress a year social emotionally. So we know that when things are out of sync, when things are out of balance, it can prove to be challenging. And the way that we used to work with kids who had sort of these gifted abilities and were far more advanced back in my day during the Stone Age is that we would say, okay, well, your math performance is that of a high schooler. So I know you're in fifth grade, but we're sending you to the high school and you can go take math at the high school. And that never really worked out because we never thought a whole lot about sort of the socio-emotional elements of that. So these are some of the things that you see when you are dealing with an individual who's gifted or talented. Now, when we add on a layer of complexity, when we add on, let's say, a learning disability as identified through IDEA or some of the other conditions we spoke of earlier, oftentimes we will see that giftedness presents differently. So this is part of the multiple exceptionality, where you will find an individual with incredibly strong verbal skills. So in speaking with them, they are absolutely phenomenal at describing, weaving a compelling yarn, telling a great story, but it does not necessarily translate into the written word. That also has somewhat of a neurobiological connection because we know, again, with written expression and when we look at reading difficulties, we're looking primarily at something that occurs in the parietal lobe, which makes it difficult to sort of bring things together and make sense of them. So when we're looking at multiple exceptional neurodiverse kids, oftentimes we will find that they have very high levels of comprehension, immediate problem solvers, and great at that, but difficulty with certain elements of reading. In multi-exceptional kids and multi-exceptional individuals, because you don't stop being neurodiverse once you graduate from high school, you will really see an intensity of interest and an intensity of focus. Now, quite honestly, we all love to learn about things that we like. We like to do things that make us happy. But the types of individuals we're talking about here, their interests are much, much more intensive. It's the candle that burns twice as bright and twice as quickly. So you may find that you have a learner and all they are interested in is horses. Today, when I was talking to a few parents about this, one of the parents related to me that her child is only interested in cats. And if it doesn't have to do with cats, they are not interested in it at all. So, if you are an ardent practitioner, if you are a good teacher, if you are a high quality pedagogue, what do? Well, if somebody is interested in horses, you make somewhat of a bespoke horse centric curriculum. So math problems involve, how much hay do I need to buy? Storytelling or English language arts, sculpt a horse's head, that sort of thing. But what we realize is that these interests are very intense, but they're also very quick. And by the time you as a practitioner, develop an entire suite of assignments related to horses, they've moved on to something else that they like. Um, Sensory sensitivities. Of course, we're talking about the five senses. If you see dead people, it might be six. Some researchers say that there are up to 72 distinct senses, but we'll stick with the five. But oftentimes you will see that these are individuals who have particular sensitivities to bright lights, to noises. They're very easily distracted to the point where they're unable to concentrate. So somebody tapping their fingers, things like that, are very much distracting to them. Oftentimes, we see that these are individuals who miss certain social cues, and have difficulty with interaction. Some of this comes from giftedness. Some of it might come from other sort of elements of multiple exceptionality. We call it reading the room. Some will call it emotional intelligence, but oftentimes they're not picking up on social cues that others might have. So again, these are, it's not a laundry list. It's not, if I get 7 of these, then I'm multi exceptional. It's just some of the characteristics that have been defined by research. Rapid idea generation and poor follow through. And I don't think this is necessarily exclusive to multi exceptional or neurodiverse individuals. It's always fun to come up with ideas, but sometimes the labor that you have to put in thereafter is just not fun. So we have a lot of kids who will come and say, I am going to, build a bridge constructed out of recycled milk bottles, and it's going to be exclusively for walking over, and this is what it's going to be like, and everybody gets very excited. But when it comes time to actually constructing a model of it, well, that doesn't go so well. And what will oftentimes happen, especially when we look at executive function, for these kids, gifted and talented especially, there's no real excitement in the follow through. And when you are charged with doing the follow through, oftentimes you'll procrastinate because you're thinking, I can't ever get it just the way I want it, or it's too boring. And what winds up happening, and I think this winds up happening with all of us at one point, that you procrastinate, but you do smaller tasks to fill the void. The brain loves to solve a problem, and when you complete a task, you get a wonderful neurochemical cocktail that includes endorphins and dopamine and oxytocin, which encourages you to move forward. So when people are faced, let's say, with filing taxes, and they say, okay, on Saturday I'm going to get up early and I'm going to file them. I'm going to file by 10 a.m. and it's going to be great and it's all going to be done. Come Saturday morning, you wake up a little bit late, and well, I can't really file these yet because I need to have my pencils organized, and I need to put these things in a pile. And completing those smaller tasks give you the same sort of buzz as you would get for completing large tasks, because the brain really doesn't sort of distinguish between taxes and collecting paper clips in an organized way. So that has to do a lot with executive function, how we make decisions. What you will find in gifted and talented individuals specifically, but even more pronounced in multiple exceptional individuals, is perfectionism and imposter syndrome. We have a whole series of courses on perfectionism, but really the perfectionist is his or her own greatest enemy, because uh, perfection is not objectively defined. And the way that we think about perfectionism, and again, it's not universal, and certainly giftedness and talent are not universal. Some people are perfectionists in one area and maybe not in others. But a good analogy is running a race, and as you approach the finish line, and all of your family and your friends are cheering you on, and there's the finish line, and as you approach, it moves 500 feet back, and so you're always chasing perfection, because it's self-defined. Imposter syndrome is sort of the second cousin of perfectionism, where people who are absolutely phenomenal in all respects tend to believe that they're pulling the wool over people's eyes, that they don't belong where they are, that they're going to be found out eventually. Maya Angelou, an incredible poet, suffered from imposter syndrome and thought people are going to find out that I'm not as great as they think that I am. So again, it is really sort of the second cousin to perfectionism. And we see this a lot at the university. We see this a lot with first generation students. who maybe feel they don't belong. They're putting on airs, they're putting on an act. But we see this quite a bit with multi-exceptional kids and individuals, which leads to frustration. Very critical, very fearful of failure when you look at giftedness and talent specifically, but multiple exceptions as well. You will see that they look outwardly for approval and inwardly for blame. And irrespective of what activity they are undertaking, they always feel that the spotlight is on them. They're in their room, they're alone, they're putting away their socks, but they're always very cognizant that somebody's going to, you know, look and see how the socks are arranged. So they're always sort of under the spotlight. And even if somebody else is being criticized in the classroom, somehow they connect it to something that they've done. Um, Out of this, you might see a bit of social withdrawal because it's such a big risk to put yourself out there. Mood swings and emotional dysregulation. So again, not a checklist. It's not, if I got 3 out of 5, then this is where I am, but really sort of an amalgam of characteristics, both from practice and from research. You may also see hyperactivity when we talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what winds up happening is that in many cases, the individual or the family will have limited access to resources. When you think of identification specifically, school districts and charter schools all identify giftedness and talent in different ways using different batteries, and they may miss some of the finer points. And the thing is that these are not batteries that are offered for free. They're very expensive. So there's a trade-off. There's always a push and pull between serving, the maximum number of kids, and giving them that, and specificity. I mean, you can get all the data that you need if you're willing to do the outlay for it. There are some cases where practitioners and administrators have limited opportunities for professional development. So again, some of the finer points that we talk about may not be immediately manifest to them. And this is not just for teachers and administrators, but it's also for parents. We at UC San Diego work collaboratively with practitioners, parents, and administrators to make sure we're all somewhat singing from the same hymnal, as it were. Um, Attention to life challenges may overshadow giftedness. So if we're looking at somebody who, let's say, may be dyslexic or may be hard of hearing, the focus will be on, that versus looking for giftedness. If there are behavioral issues, they'll be, the school will be looking at that versus looking for giftedness. Gifted and talented specifically are not great help seekers. And then when you have the additional overlay, you want to wear an emotional suit of armor, pretend that everything is okay. As you approach adolescence, if you're a tween or if you are a teen, you may not ask for help. And this is really middle school and high school is where these kids tend to slip through the cracks. And English learners may not be properly identified or diagnosed. Most of our identification processes are language dependent. There's a few like Raven's matrices and others that are not so much. But English learners and those who are living in poverty tend to be under-identified at pretty significant rates. So one of the things that you see about some of the strengths that we talk about, that they compensate or mask struggles, and that yields a neutral effect. So it will seem like a kid is getting by fine. Somebody, they seem very smart, but probably not gifted. That is because it is really sort of, a patchwork of different things going on at the same time. And a lot of the ways that we do identification or diagnostics just don't have that the ability to pick up on the subtleties. You will also see a lot of impulsivity. You may see street smarts that don't translate to the traditional classroom. So, outside in the world, these are kids who may be negotiating for their parents if they're second language learners, or they're sort of very good at navigating the world, but that doesn't necessarily show in the classroom. And they may have a negative reaction to schooling, not only because of the experiences they have, but the way that content is taught may rub up against the way that they like to learn. And it's an ongoing conflict. And it is it's not just in elementary school, it's not just in middle school, it's a lifelong conflict where you'll see a kid and, well, you know they may be gifted, but they're not gifted enough. They don't sort of look like the traditional gifted students. um, Oftentimes we don't account for the different types of giftedness, and we assume a universality of giftedness, and this idea that, well, if you are a gifted mathematician, then you should also be a gifted writer and a gifted dancer, because your giftedness should permeate. And that just doesn't work like that. Again, we talk about these are kids falling through the cracks, absent support. Um, and these are kids who can process with incredible speed, but the output tends to be slower. So in their heads, they've got the problems all solved, but you may not see it in the classroom. You may not see it in their writing. So um, Oftentimes, you will hear, in one specific instance, I heard about a neurodiverse learner, a multi-exceptional kid as well. They're just not trying hard enough. And look at all the potential it's wasted. And again, that does not account for how these things sort of ebb and flow. Now, here I'm not going to read through all of these, but I will make sure that anybody who would like this slide deck or this piece specifically will get it. And what this is sort of a meta-analysis of how giftedness is presented. So we look, for example, at the way traditional giftedness presents in terms of basic skills and verbal ability and reading ability. But when we look at different elements of intersectionality, you will see that there are idiosyncrasies attached with that. And then, if it is a case where we're dealing with, let's say, an identified learning disability, and you maybe another exceptionality, or something like that, there are nuances and subtleties that practitioners need to consider in their approaches. So, if you look, for example, at verbal ability, and if you're looking at an English learner, they may have incredible verbal ability in their native language, and unless you're a dual immersion school, you're probably not going to pick up on that. You may see delayed development. You may see difficulty in writing versus speaking. So again, it's not a checklist, it's not definitive, but gives you an idea of sort of the breadth and depth of elements of giftedness and how they translate into multiple exceptionality. You look, for example, at questioning. Some kids may not feel comfortable questioning a teacher. Some parents may not feel comfortable questioning a teacher. And sometimes the questions may seem aggressive, but it's just the way that it's presented. It may appear disrespectful. Creativity, risk taking. You can see that there are different, approaches and ideas about this. Isolation and leadership ability, and we know things like wide range of interests are impacted as well. So again, this I will make sure that this is available to you if it is of interest. Now, when we think about our gifted and talented learners, we tend to have a perception of them as perhaps being very attentive, sitting up straight, very much active listeners. But that's not always how it presents itself. So With a multi-exceptional learner, with a neurodiverse learner, what you have is the giftedness will mask learning disabilities, and the learning disabilities mask giftedness. This complicates assessments if you think the impacts of trauma. Um, or you look at a kid and say, well, they're doing well enough. So they're doing great in classes. Yeah, they may have some quirks, but we're not going to test for learning disability because they're doing fine. They're absolutely doing fine. Um, and then when you look at neurodivergence, oftentimes it's interpreted to be a behavioral challenge. This is somebody who is acting out in class, who doesn't raise their hands before they speak. And sometimes it is presented particularly in that way. Some of the additional challenges. We look at anxiety, we look at imposter syndrome and perfectionism, and oftentimes it presents as obstinance. Oftentimes it presents as disengagement or defiance. And you can see in this slide, we talk about different types of imposter syndrome, again, because there's no sort of monolithic definition and it impacts differently. Oftentimes, if kids are doing well in school and if they're keeping up with everything, we tend to overlook their emotional struggles or what happens after they leave us. And when it comes to sort of the intake element of this, oftentimes we lack multiple perspectives. And again, this may have to do with things like budgets, things like allocation. What we really need is a tapestry approach or a combination of different types of assessments. And you will find that, again, at least in terms of identification, you will have states or you will have schools or you will have school districts who will say, well, we're just going to look at grades and a kid with great grades. Well, obviously they're gifted because they're doing very well. Some will try to do a combination of grades and IQ. They might throw in a cognitive or emotional battery, but again, those are not only expensive to acquire, but they're expensive to do the analysis of them. Now, in California, if you go to the California Department of Education and you look up giftedness and talent, they will present you with a number of criteria for identification. So maybe it's leadership, maybe it's academic ability, maybe it is creativity. If you are part of a very large well-funded school district, and I'm thinking about places like our own San Diego Unified School District, Los Angeles Unified School District, maybe San Francisco Unified, they will measure probably on all of those criteria. They will have, if we're looking at creatively or artistically gifted, you will have a panel of experts who can analyze a portfolio. And certainly, if you are from the Los Angeles area, you can probably throw a rock and hit somebody who is capable of judging dramatic performance. But again, these inconsistencies can be troublesome. The more data you have, so much the better. So again, you really have to look at a variety of approaches. So, for example, um, teachers are with kids for the most part of the largest part of every day. Why would not they be able to identify or submit a recommendation for testing or for parents? So again, oftentimes you have kids who will not be identified. They will be under identified. They will be misidentified. We look at development patterns. So how do the strengths and challenges sort of interweave together? And again, we mentioned a few of the different types of batteries. And here you have multiple intelligences, and I probably need not explain those to you because I'm sure when you were little kids and you were playing in school, they probably came up to you and said, okay, here is a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Here, Gardner's multiple intelligences. And here's Bloom's taxonomy. But these other batteries here measure different elements of giftedness and talent, and perhaps different elements of multiple exceptionality. We have the COGAT, the Torrance test of creative thinking, profile of creative abilities, portfolio and performance evaluation, teacher recommendation, and parent and caregiver input. And as you can imagine, as you know, you know, as you add more, the expense gets greater and the complexity of delivery and assessment gets to be greater as well. There are also something that we call the WISC 5, the Stanford Binet, if you remember that, an oldie but a goodie, the Woodcock Johnson test of achievement, comprehensive test of phonological processing, behavior rating of executive function. So again, the more of these that we use, the more of these that we employ, the closer we are going to get to accuracy. But again, these are not inexpensive prospects. So what are we trying to do? Where are we trying to go with these kids? What are we trying to do? And um, it's not solely about classroom performance, but it's also about feeling contented. And it all comes down to neurobiology. It all comes down to neurochemistry. So because our brain is survival based, every time we do something that enhances our survival, whether it's doing well in school, whether it's finding a new route to work, whether it's eating healthily, whether it's exercising, our brain gives us a reward. And this reward is a phenomenal chemical cocktail comprised of endorphins that gives us euphoria, dopamine, which stimulates our executive decision center, oxytocin, and I want to be very, very clear because the spellings are similar. This is not OxyContin. I don't want you going away and say, oh, yeah, well, if you take OxyContin, everything's going to be great. This is oxytocin, which we call the puppy love chemical. It is the neurochemical associated with trust and warmth and relationships, and then serotonin, a chemical associated with well-being. So if you are getting that sort of neurochemical experience after doing something, whether it's going to class and things like that, you're going to want to keep going to do it. And we call that the neurochemistry of persistence. Now, on the other hand, the neurochemistry of avoidance is really activating our survival mechanism. So when we have negative feelings, when we do something that's counter to our survival, we immediately produce adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, which puts our brain into survival mode, focuses on an immediate problem, but also causes anxiety and stress. And what we want to do in the classroom and what we want to do at home is provide more opportunities for engaging the neurochemistry of persistence and fewer opportunities to engage the neurochemistry of avoidance. And the ways in which we craft a instructional delivery and support our multi-exceptional kids will dictate that. I mentioned Maslow earlier, so we just took sort of a physiological view of persistence and avoidance, and now we can take one that is psychological. Of course, Maslow's hierarchy is not perfect by any means, but it does give us a fairly fundamental idea about where our needs are. So our most basic needs, our most basic physical needs are security and safety, food, water, warmth, and rest. And what Maslow says here is you really can't start to worry about friendships or doing well in school if your most basic needs are not satisfied. So if you are, for example, a kid who's watching your parents fight, or if you are a kid where you have a parent who loses a job and they're worried about losing the house and you don't feel secure, or maybe you are getting bullied on the way to school, you're not going to be worried about your report on, the movement westward in social studies. You're not going to worry about how many friends you have because you're just trying to solve the most basic problems. So, as Maslow says here, you satisfy your safety needs, you go on to belongingness and esteem, and ultimately at some point you will achieve your full potential. I don't know if anybody's got to that point yet. I know that I certainly have not. But again, this is just another way of looking at the neurochemical. When we talk about pedagogy, now we've been talking a lot about science, we've been talking a lot about assessment, we've been talking a lot about neurochemistry. But really, when we talk about pedagogy, we are talking about a formal definition, which is the art, science, or profession of teaching. Profession, absolutely. Science, absolutely. But sometimes we neglect the artistry. And this is the artistry of instruction, because I do not know any little kid who wanted to be a teacher who was absolutely fascinated by scope and sequence or frameworks or standards. They loved the stagecraft. And teachers, as you know, you can work with those things that are within your scope of control. Some things you can't control, some things you can. Allocation of time and space, that's all you. Introducing novelty, different ways to look at information and take it in, different ways to process information, different ways to showcase knowledge, and pacing. That's all left to you for the most part. So it is really important that you're able to connect again with that. So what do we look like when we're looking at goodness of fit? How do we attend to the needs of neurodiverse learners or multi-exceptional learners? There's a variety of ways to do that. Universal design for learning, flexible pathways, this idea that there are differentiated routes to get to a common destination. And that's sort of the premise of differentiated instruction. What you see here is Kaplan's icons, which is and you're probably all familiar with Kaplan's icons by now, universal themes and content imperatives. But this is a way to reach a good variety of learners, not just good for the gifted and talented or the multi-exceptional, but for everybody. Having kids being able to see themselves in what is being taught, have them being able to express themselves, this idea of choice and voice and volition. Engagement and including gamification. Now, I'm not saying that the whole class needs to sort of be one just long episode of Super Mario Brothers or whatever kids or Fortnite or whatever they're playing today, but oftentimes introducing those elements of novelty really will appeal to the gifted and talented as well as the neurodiverse, the multi-exceptional student. Inquiry and project-based learning, very important. Again, if you think about how we've often dealt with kids who show promise, they are able to fly through worksheets. You give them single digit multiplication, they're flying through it, and instead of moving on to sort of the next more complex construct, you just say, well, okay, you finished early, fill out these other problems and really show me that you can do it. In education, of course, we call that punishment for mastery. Not a great way to fall in love with the endeavor. Trauma-informed teaching, again, very important. It goes beyond our typical understanding of socio-emotional learning. It goes much deeper. There's a lot of research that speaks to the benefit of this emerging from our experiences in the pandemic. And I think that we all just sort of we slipped back into routine, and we really never talked about any of this. And then culturally responsive teaching is another way to get there as well. So when we look at the multi-exceptional learner, oftentimes we want to not only support their emotional connection to teaching and learning, but we also want to enhance their metacognitive abilities. These what they used to call soft skills, some people call them 21st century skills. This idea of sound habits of mind, creativity, communication, independent work, resilience, all of that sort of thing. And when we accelerate and enrich in areas of strength, so if you have a multi-exceptional learner who's showing real promise in a particular area, you want to appeal to the strengths, because one of the things that we know, that competence breeds confidence and confidence breeds competence. So it's all part of the neurochemistry. It's all part of the feeling of doing something well, doing something successful, and really sort of balancing out challenges with strengths, infusing choice in as much as possible. Now, this is not something germane solely to the gifted and talented or the neurodiverse. But if you ask kids about school and what their greatest lament, their greatest gripe about school is everything is foisted upon them. They don't really have a choice. Am I saying, just have them come in and do whatever they feel like doing during the day? Not at all. But if you are able to do something like a choice board, or give them options within a particular set of parameters. Sometimes when we're doing English language arts, we do RAFT, which is role, audience, format, and topic. Use of graphic organizers and chunking for those kids who either are working with ADD, ADHD, or reading process difficulties, breaking things into smaller pieces and availing opportunities to sort of help them get organized in a visual way is one. And then multisensory and multimodal approaches, visual, oral, and kinesthetic. And coming up when I was going to school, if you were not a visual learner or an oral learner, you were pretty much left out. Maybe you'll get 2/3 of the class, maybe you won't. But there's a lot to be said for a kinesthetic approach. This idea of I learn by doing, I learn by putting my hands on things. And I will tell you that I was a spectacularly bad student in math. When it came to algebra, I was absolutely, completely confused, because the way that we worked algebra is, if train A leaves Detroit at 12 o'clock going 60 miles an hour, and train B leaves Kansas City heading north at 11 o'clock at a rate of 70 miles an hour, when will these two trains intersect? Well, first of all, I did not grow up in a place with a lot of trains. So, I would take my pencils and try to pretend that they were trains. Ultimately, I kept thinking, well, why would you care when they intersect? I mean, are they in danger of crashing? Are you going to meet somebody on the other train? And, why wouldn't you just fly? So again, this sort of abstract, non-conventional thought that can also take up a lot of time. When you use multisensory, when you involve all of the senses and you involve all of the modalities of learning, you're going to wind up capturing the minds of more than you would than just perhaps in traditional senses. For some of our neurodiverse learners, especially kinesthetic learners, when we look at kinesthetic learners specifically, you might come to the conclusion that they have attention problems, because they're fidgety and they're looking around and they're moving their legs, and they're getting up and they're sitting down. But for some individuals, that is how they learn best, by putting hands on things. So I mentioned the algebra example. I didn't really understand the whole idea of ratios and proportions until I took a class in auto shop. Now, I don't think auto shop exists anymore. If anybody sort of needs an explanation of what that is, but basically it would teach you how to repair cars at the school. The school had a garage and a car that you would pull apart and put back together again. And, between that and doing a set design for theater, I finally understood how math sort of works. Like, you need 2 of these and 3 of this, etc. But for those who are moving around, oftentimes they need to move to process information. And I know, as a somewhat kinesthetic learner, that when I am learning something, or if I am reviewing it, I have this luxury as an adult that I will walk around and I will sort of read it aloud. I need to be moving for it to be processed. Oftentimes, visual timers and checklists that facilitate transitions are important, and it helps kids who may have a particular exceptionalities get organized and move from one place to another. We look at things that are color coding or task tracking apps. And really, at some point, saying something is good enough. So when we're working with perfectionism and we're working with imposter syndrome, um, again, the perfectionist is their own worst enemy. And, that's why they do not do well in standardized tests with multiple choice, because for the gifted and talented individual, the multi-exceptional individual, they could probably think of a world in which all of these things might be true. So, again, reaching the point where it's good enough and valuing the journey over the destination. Even though the journey may not be perfect, it's still important. Low stakes, no stakes practices, bursts and breaks, 20 to 25 minutes of intensive learning, and then break. It goes sort of very well with our social media culture where things are delivered in espresso shots versus carafes. Scheduled breaks and safe spaces. So when the intensity starts to build, there's a place to go to have some quiet reflection, quiet downtime. Mindfulness, of course, this is a huge topic in and of itself, but really finding ways to live in the moment and to stem as best as one can the flow of cognitive lava. And then really a lot of support when it comes to IEP meetings, looking at student-led IEP meetings, and making connections with peers. So very important, for example, with giftedness and talent, where many of these kids tend to suffer perfectionism in silence. And sometimes it's great just to sit down with others and sort of get the giftedness off your chest. When you're working with families, this idea of open and ongoing communication, because it's not so much this is what we do in school and then you do what you do at home. It is a continuum of support, which is much different than things used to be. Um, being clear, being specific, focusing on strengths, clarity and specificity are so very important because in all individuals, ambiguity tends to beget anxiety because our brains are trying to fill the void of information. We're trying to solve a problem. So as clear as we can be, it's important. Active listening, incredibly important. Not only teaching your kids to do it, but doing it yourself as a teacher, doing it yourself as a parent. Working together, understanding some of the cultural sensitivities, helping families to navigate the system. We are an acronym rich profession. And I've been doing this for almost 3 decades now. And I don't think I've tackled half of the acronyms in my own institution. So, supporting parents with workshops, specialized in general topics. You can imagine when a parent who may not usually have contact with educators or not studied education, walking into an IEP for the very first time and seeing all of these people sitting around a table representing different interests and different organizations, can be not only daunting, but frightening. And being able to support parents. Now, for members of the El Dorado County Charter SELPA, we can offer free parent university, and that is where the university works with parents specifically on these types of topics: fundamental neuroscience, emotional development, all sorts of things, but also sort of the education 101. And then promote advocacy and clear understanding of rights and responsibilities. Oftentimes, parents who have rights under IDEA, or responsibilities, they're not aware of them. They feel as though they always have to advocate for themselves. So you want to serve as a practitioner, as an advocate for them too. So it's a good way to support families. So some of the things that we're sort of worried about, and I think this is probably no secret to all of you at the federal level, um, the special education at the federal level has been just about gutted. I think they are just holding on by threads. There are executive orders coming out that target certain elements of civil rights where you may see less inclusive environments. Always wondering about a Title I funding, and because it's such an important resource for multi-exceptional learners, if that is getting phased out, or if that will change, what does that mean for those that we support? Um, Increased financial burdens. So if you're not getting support from the federal government, it doesn't mean that the needs go away. So the state absorbs those burdens. You know, with respect to things like the 10th Amendment, and those powers not articulated here are delegated to the states, you find that most education budgets are supported by local and state taxes. But again, the budgets for the titles and things are pretty big. You'll see increasing variability in support, decentralized funding. Um, you know, uh, so they're creating sort of a system of haves and have-nots. Um, Identification and support, this idea of equity and access, and compliance issues. We're always on the lookout for that. Um, at the classroom, how do you allocate resources? How do you define services? I know that many of us, myself included, are confused or uncertain about how policies will change year after year, and how we can be better advocates for those who are inclusive. And of course, we talk about what are the socio-emotional impacts that are emerging from the pandemic. There's an incredible set of research that's coming out that talks about kids likening themselves to veterans coming home from wars, where they'll say that something that we survived and we got through it. But there are a lot of other, different parts of that we haven't explored. Oftentimes we talk about pushing the envelope without poking the bear, to really be an advocate, but not necessarily to draw negative attention. So where can we go? Where can we go as practitioners? Where can we go as parents? So rights law, available online. Expanded learning programs. I have a lot of information about that that I'm happy to share with you. Twice Exceptional Children's Advocacy Group, NAGC, CAG, California Association for the Gifted, the Davidson Institute, and SENG are just a few different places. Now,